Welcome to another edition of Cults and the Culting of America podcast. My name is Scot Loyd, along with my friend, the knitting cult lady, Daniella Mestyanek Young. Daniella, good to see you this evening. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. You know what? I
Good.
needed a shot of energy today, and I logged in and I saw that we were talking to Lydia Knight, and I am so excited. Because what our guest went through as a child is so fantastic and far out and bonkers, and is also so relevant to like the national conversation of what is happening in our country right now. Uh, and it's something that I call apocalypticizing, which like is not just a convenient way to turn apocalypse into a verb, but it's fantasizing about the apocalypse. And I think we're going to have a journey, but I just want to put this in everybody's minds that like there's a reason that panic is comforting sometimes.
All right. Well, with that introduction, our guest, Lydia Knight, is here. And wow, my interest is certainly piqued. And so I'll take a moment to introduce Lydia to our audience. She is an author, professional speaker, executive coach, and recipient of the Sacred Service Award. Her innovative approach has earned recognition from major outlets like CBS, NBC, Fox News, Yahoo, and beyond. Knight is the founder and CEO of the She Center, a top 2% woman owned business globally, where she specializes in leadership training, executive coaching, and leadership certification. Lydia, welcome. We're glad that you're here tonight.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Danielle, the couple of things that you touched on, I feel like we could go down all of these rabbit holes. Like there's so much to talk about. So I'm thrilled to be here. And I just have to say, Danielle, I loved your book so much. I had an experience reading your book where I was just crying over and over and connecting to your story in ways like I never expected to connect with someone else's story that way and be like, whoa, someone else knows how that feels. So I just wanted to, first of all, thank you. It was a really cool experience and incredibly well written. And I'm like so proud of that book that you wrote. So thank you for that.
I really appreciate
Absolutely.
that. I lost 30 pounds going through all that trauma. But, you know, one of the things that I wanted to do with my story is to show, right, that like even in the most extreme cults, it's not extreme all the time. And it might look a lot more like your thing that you didn't realize was maybe that extreme. And it's so, you know, I want you to give a little introduction of your story, of what we're alluding to, whatever you're comfortable with. Because it's so interesting how we can come from the most extreme childhoods but not realize how extreme it was.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very open about my story. You're both welcome to ask whatever. I didn't share my story for a really long time just because I'd done the healing and the moving through it, but I just thought it was too bizarre for anyone to want to hear about. And then I just, started sharing it on TikTok with a bunch of strangers because like no one's going to care about it. It's going to be cool for me to like share this before I die. And it started blowing up. So I'm quite comfortable with it now. I'm like, yep, whatever. We'll talk about all of it. So an overview of my story and where I came from, and like you were saying, had no idea I was raised in a cult. It was quite recently that I'm like, what is the word to describe what this upbringing was like? And I'm like, oh, this is a cult. So my grandmother was this very charismatic woman. She was bride of the year. She was Eldorado queen. She was sort of this like rodeo star. And very beautiful, charismatic, married someone who worked for the State Department. They lived all over the world. She had this home in the Hollywood Hills, and she loved attention. And when my mom had me and I was a toddler, then my mom started getting these revelations from God. I'll put that in quotes. And God was telling my mother this sort of undercover truth about how the world worked. So there was a band of Satan worshipers that controlled everything from government to local police departments there were so many of them, and they would all like talk in secret codes with each other. And it was all very secret. But the reason that my mom knew about it was, one, because God was telling her about it. And two, because she decided that God told her that my father was the leader of this satanic worshiper organization. And that as a toddler, I had been kidnapped, taken by these Satan worshipers, that I had been needles put in my eyes, all this brainwashing, that my spine had been broken over and over because of the gang as a toddler with all of these Satan worshipers. And I was told these explicit details just since the time I can remember. There was in the double memoir that we wrote with my dad's story, looking for his kids for 25 years, and my story growing up in this cult, there were stories that I learned from my dad that I didn't even realize because I was so young. For instance, when I went and visited him as a toddler, I would get up on his lap and I would say things like, well, I don't know if you're mean. And he's like, no, I'm not mean. I love you. And I would just look at him in the face and be like, Daddy, why do you want to kill me? These were the things that were just taught to me all growing up. And so we were always, it was witness protection-esque, right? Like we were always moving in the middle of the night. If we got a suspicious call, we decided that we were always being hunted. My mother would keep on getting these new revelations from God to know how to look out for Satan worshipers. And there was this fear. And like you were talking about fear being comforting, it really bound our family together. Like we had this little family that was like, well, we know a secret that no one else knows, but that we could be triggered at any time. So I could hear some word or, have some children's toy given to me that was designed by the Satan worshipers, and I would be triggered. My brain would be broken into 1,000 pieces, different personalities. I'd be under the control of Satan. So that's a super quick version of the background of how I grew up.
And Lydia, for those who might be listening, could you say a little bit about race also? Because your grandmother was a white Mormon lady, correct?
Correct. So on the white side of my family, we were like sort of Mormon lineage. So like Las Vegas, Nevada, St. George, Utah, all those started as Mormon colonies. And that was my family. So I'm descended from like the fifth wife of this Mormon colonist guy, Dudley Levitt. So we were Mormon all the way back. So that side of my family is white. My grandmother, my mother, and there was a lot of racism, just sort of inherent in being a white woman growing up Mormon. It was an intense racism. And they'd also grown up all over the world. So my mother and her brother had been exposed to, people that weren't white and looked different than them. And so all of the grandkids were either half Chinese, like my brother and I, or half Latin or Hispanic. And I remember my grandmother pulling aside a friend one day, like right in front of me, right? She didn't hide it, but pulling aside a friend and apologizing to her friend that none of her grandkids were white. Like it was something that she was very ashamed of. And I grew up in Utah. I didn't see another Asian person until I was in high school and like went on a school trip to a bigger city and saw another Asian person. And I was taught to be terrified of Asian people because they were especially in the cult, right? Like, my dad is Chinese. And so there was that association, but there was also this idea in the satanic panic of the 80s, which we'll probably get into, but I didn't know it was a bigger phenomenon than my family, but that there was like Asian people were just inherently sort of satanic, right? It's like, oh, that's a given. If you see an Asian person, they're definitely a member of the cult. So when I saw other Asian people, I was so terrified of that. And I remember, I'd have times where I looked in the mirror and saw how my face really, looked like just my own reflection. And I would break out into tears because how I looked, the non-white part of me, was quite terrifying to me. So there were multiple ways it wove in, but those were some ways that race came up.
I mean, that's such an interesting parallel for me because I used to kind of like joke and say like the children of God like accidentally did their racism wrong, right? Because just like every other cult out of the 60s, like it was about keeping us from them, right? It was about taking our precious white children away. But then they went international, right? They went all over the world. Like I grew up in Brazil and Mexico and but I also think that inside these systems, right, we often don't like unpack our internalized racism and like what that experience was and how different it is, you know, being in these high control white religions as a white child or as someone who's not considered quite as perfect, and how much, you know, that plays in just really complex ways, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And growing up, the racism and that internalized racism was more challenging as a child than feeling and believing that I had grown up in a cult and had all these horrible things happen to me. Like, is the racism was so real and in my face every day. So that was a huge struggle growing up.
Lydia, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge, wow, what you experienced and what you had to endure growing up. That's very traumatic, and I'm sorry that you had to endure that. Do you have any idea what informed this racism and this satanic panic? Was it a connection to the Mormon religion? Was it informed by that, or were there other factors at play?
Yeah, great question. And as I've unpacked this, as I've gotten older, I started telling my story like as an adult. Like I just didn't tell it very often. And I remember sharing a little bit of it with a friend one day. And he's like, I think I heard a podcast about this. And I'm like, no, you didn't. Like, this was a bizarre thing that only happened to me. And I listened to this podcast and realized there was this bigger phenomenon of the satanic panic in the 80s. So that was a big piece of it, is sort of the tenets of how people were believing that there were these, Satan worshipers, and a lot of Christian religions were believing that. I think that racism also really came into play from Mormonism. There is a lot of, so for instance, in the Book of Mormon, there's a curse that is like all throughout the Book of Mormon, which is these people were evil and they were cursed with a skin of darkness. So there's this idea of if you're not white, it's literally a curse that was created. And like my grandfather, Jima, who is like my cult leader grandmother, so I call him Jima and Jipa. But I remember him sitting us down and giving us this really long lecture with all these like Bible references, and like he would sort of go off on things. And the sort of punchline of his lecture was that he was complimenting my brother and I because our skin was whiter than it used to be. He could tell that in Book of Mormon words, white and delightsome, like this is the way to be. So he knew that we were becoming better people because I guess we weren't in the sun as much as we used to be, but like he attributed to like, you're probably better than you used to be righteousness wise because our skin was lighter. So there's Mormon stuff in there. There's cultural stuff in there. I think there was a lot of different directions that racism was coming from. But the root of it, I believed, was that my grandmother, my cult leader, Jima, did not like that my mother had married somebody who wasn't white. And so villainizing that, the racial part of it, I think was a good reason for her to break up that marriage and then to also create this story and become the savior of the story.
Yeah. And there's something greater here with the satanic panic and racism also that I really want to tie in, which is like the satanic panic basically is what we believe was the reaction to human beings getting online, right? Which I like to point out for people, like this was an apocalypse that we all lived through, right? The industrial age crashing into the information age, and finding out how badly children were being abused, right? And like Freud, who in the 20s or something listened to women and children and then said at the end of his study, said, this can't be true because if it's true, all men are monsters. So I'm going to decide that women and children were lying. Right. And now, by the way, we've come even further because now DNA is proving how common, right, incest and abuse is in the home. But in the 80s and 90s, we're just starting to feel the impact of the information age. And we're starting to realize how often children are being abused. And so it was easier for people, white people, to tell themselves that it was bands of satanic people stealing children and abusing them than it was to say that like your brother or your pastor was the one abusing the children, right? So it was I mean, it was literally the witch hunts by another name, right? It's Pizzagate by another name. Um, and then there's this really complicated layer of all of you children who were absolutely abused by growing up with these people telling you these things, right? I mean, it sounds like you had a mix of like mom cult leader and grandma cult leader, and mom was maybe a little bit not too mentally stable, and all of these different things going on. But a lot of it, I think, tied into also like racially diversifying America rapidly. And this was very, very scary for people. Right. And it was just so much easier to be like them, the other, the different people, right? They're doing these horrible things to our perfect children. And I just like really have to emphasize that always in this imagery is like little blonde, blue eyed children who are having their souls sucked out of them by these Satan worshipers, right? Like the poor, perfect white. And this is why I think we have so many examples of Mormons, right? Sort of being like really involved in this sort of satanic panic industry, which of course gives us, you know, Teal Swan and other interesting people.
Yeah, that's come up a few times. I was like, oh, okay. It's the conclusions that some other people that have been through perhaps a similar experience to myself have come to have surprised me. I've been learning so much recently.
And I mean, I recently got into a clash with followers of a certain Cisnet. Um, that's Swan if you speak a Latin language. Because I was talking about how the satanic panic was made up, right? There's a reason we call it satanic panic and not the survivors of X satanic cult, right? There were 1,200 cases researched, right? As you mentioned, right? There was a larger thing going on, right? This was a thing that spread throughout the country. And as soon as you say like, oh, this didn't happen, people jump down your throat and say, how dare, right? Like, how dare you say, especially as a abuse survivor yourself, right, that children didn't suffer this, right? Like, how dare you say that people weren't ritually abused? And it's, you know, again, there's so many complex things here, right? Like, have individuals ritually abused children in like ways that they were calling satanic? Yes, right? Humans, there's no limit to the amount of suffering that humans will put each other through. But like, was there a large cabal of Asians and other people like around the country trafficking children and babies and, you know, all of the things you mentioned, right, that would have left these physical marks and all of these different things. And then there's the deeper even, right, of the abuse that was done to you by making you believe that and having it's what's called disorganized attachment, right, of the humans that you relied on for safety and care also being the ones who were harming you, which is a very universal cult baby experience.
Yes, and in a way where they were harming me in the guise of that they were protecting me from this like absolute evil. So there are all these strange layers. And one reason that it took me so long to conclude with the language of cult is because my whole life I was told that we were running from the cult, like we're running from these Satan worshipers, but in short, we just called them the cult for code. So I was like, oh, I mean, surely it wasn't a cult because that was the thing that we were running from. I'm like, no, it was a cult that had a story about a cult that we were running from. And it's wild to think of how many things that were accused, you know, of other people did that, but it was actually the abusers that were doing it. Yeah.
And
And
isn't
it
that
strikes me.
always like isn't that always like, I almost feel like they know how to make the accusations because they're the ones doing it.
Yeah. And it just got more and more complex sort of as time went on. And it is that confusing, like, what is real, and almost the gaslighting of, well, I certainly couldn't mention this to them because it's almost laughable that I would accuse them of the very thing that they were trying to protect me from and save my life from my whole life. So it gets into this weird knot.
Yeah, and it strikes me, that given all of our experiences with cults and high control groups, even though the abuse is on a spectrum, it strikes me that there are a common denominator within these groups. The idea of secret knowledge, like we know better than anyone else. And then also this idea of creating a monster that is outside the group, that is always threatening the group, in fact, threatening the most vulnerable in the group. And it's amazing to me that all of these groups were blaming this imaginary satanic cabal that is out there, this conspiracy, when they were the ones that were inflicting harm on children in the name of God, in the name of Jesus, in the name of their religion. And they were the ones that were perpetuating this evil. So I think you see this in a lot of these groups, right? This idea that we have secret knowledge, we know what's really happening and what's really going on, and this extends into the consumption of information in the day and age in which we live. How many times do you see someone claiming, well, I know the media is saying this, but they're biased and I'm not, or the media source that I am getting my information from, they're not the mainstream media. They're not the media. I always tell people, if someone on television is telling you not to trust the media, remember, they are the media.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And like you were saying earlier, that just keeps on coming up for me, Daniella, of how comforting or how special that secret feels. Because that's the way that, Jima really drew people in. She would call person after person for hours, and I would sit next to her and hear this over and over for hours. But she'd tell them all of these horrible, explicit details of these secrets of what had happened, all the things the Satan worshipers were doing, and ask them to go without food or water, like as a strong prayer. In the Mormon church, it's called fasting. But then when they would see each other at church on Sunday, I mean, these people would break out, like they'd see my brother and I, and they'd just break out into tears, knowing the horrors that had happened to us. And then they would look at my grandmother and just fill with praise and literally say things like, thank you for saving the lives of these children. And there was this, hey, we've got this really special secret together. And it was very bonding.
Every time I hear you talk about like your grandmother and this reaction, it's like spiritual Munchausen by proxy. Right? Like she was getting the attention of the Munchausen by proxy, right? Like that's what they're doing it for. Like they're hurting their kids so that their kids go to the hospital so that then they get care and attention because their kid is in the hospital. But she didn't even have to like physically harm you. She was just able to build this lie story, right? Like origin story. And also it's so interesting, right? Because like the Children of God is considered the extreme cult. And I'm like, this is a very similar thing to what we were taught, which was like everyone in the outside world was absolutely evil, right? You systemites. And I feel your pain with the like, I was like, our bad guys were called the system. And now I'm a scholar of groups and systems, and I'm going to spend my life criticizing the system. It's like, no. But there's this weird thing I think you'll relate to, this weird feeling of like deconstructing, but realizing that like the cult antis weren't wrong when they said like the outside world was evil or like there are these problems, right? Like children were being abused, right? It just wasn't in the way that it was being said. But I think there's this really like, for me, there's like this meta experience of discovering that the United States really kind of is a lot of times the bad guy, and the systems that we're in really don't work for people because that's what the cult said, right? That's why they pulled us all out of the world in my parents or grandparents, obviously, in like the 60s and 70s, to go build this cult. And it's this weird thing where I still feel like the seeker thing is valid, right? The like wanting to change the world and like wanting to find systems that work for everyone. And it's so hard for us when we come out of like being raised that way, because I think we validly want that, but it's also super triggering.
Yeah. And I'm sure this has come up for you, criticizing the systems, and me, deprogramming from the cult and teaching other women how to deprogram from their oppressive upbringings or their, traumatic religious experiences, or just, the stuff that as women we get programmed into our mind, living in this world that doesn't serve us. And it's interesting to see how some people have, felt triggered by that and would accuse me of like, well, you're creating a cult. I'm like, well, part of healing is that you can really look at what happened. You can process that, and you can take principles that can help other people if that's what you want to do. But that reactive, well, I'm going to be the exact opposite of everything that I've been taught growing up, you're still controlled by the systems that controlled you when you were young if you're going to react to that. So finding those threads of truth of like, this principle still makes sense. We do want to have systems that serve us better. There are systems that don't serve us. And I think it's important to find those truths and to be authentic in that instead of living a life of, reactivity.
And I have just today been talking about rapture psychology and like persecution porn. And I think it's really important for us who are activists on the left, who might have come from like religious extremist backgrounds, to like take a pause and understand that like we're really triggered right now. Like every day I'm like, how are my people running the government, right? How is it possible that I spent 35 years like surviving that and fighting and putting my life together, and now these people are running the government? But the reason that apocalypticizing works, I keep repeating to people, is because when you think the rapture is about to come, you just stand there and lift up your arms, right? Like if you think the rockets are incoming in 20 minutes, like that time they sent out this message to Hawaii by accident, like you just sit down and hug your family. And so like I just think it's an important thing to talk about, that we should all probably kind of like almost just like understand that we're all triggered right now. Like we're triggered, we're pissed, and like rapture psychology. If we think about the things we were taught, right? This world is not my home, but there's no place like home, right? We're just all of the suffering you deal with in this world, right? All of the tiredness, all of the sacrifice, all of the everything. Children you have lost, loved ones you have lost, everything. It's going to be better in this perfect world. And, this was something I tried to show in Uncultured in my Apocalypse Now chapter. And I think it's really relevant to the conversations of right now, is that, cult members aren't afraid of the apocalypse. They're prepared. They want, they want the end time to come. They want what your grandmother would have given for there to be an actual satanic cult actually abusing children, right? Because then their thing was valid and their sacrifices were valid.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in the vein of what's happening in America right now, it's interesting because I know that we've all evaluated the programming we grew up with and those stories, and then to start evaluating in like a different category. Like I have thought about American propaganda and the programming from growing up in this country more than ever before, just because of what's happening. And this is something I don't think you know since last time we had chatted, which has been such a strange experience. But I started telling my story. Then I got back in contact with Jima because she's my daughter's great grandmother, and I wanted my daughter to meet the women that she came from, even if they are cult leaders. So we went on a trip and met Jima like in person. So I was like in contact with her. 2 weeks later, after I visited her last, she died. So Jima passed. And that was a weird experience for me in ways that I didn't think, because like she was an evil person, but she's also the person that raised me more than anyone else.
Also your person.
Yeah. And my mother kept her death a secret for weeks. And my uncle found out from a neighbor that talked to him, like sort of condolences. That's how he found out that his mom died. And so all of this weird movement started happening with the cult that I grew up in. Jima died on January 16th, and the inauguration was January 20th. So I've been having this experience of seeing this like macro and micro cult stuff just be spinning so fast. And it has been a really weird and very disturbing experience to see it on both levels.
And that's interesting. That's interesting that these groups and even the government that we're seeing, right, that they create these outside entities, because if you're going to embrace a doctrine that believes in a supernatural deity, an experience that has supernaturally chosen you and only your group has this special knowledge, then there better be a big bad, right, on the other side of that can be the antithesis to everything that you claim to represent. And so in your case, they created these satanic cults, warned you about them, kept you afraid of them, and then told you that the only escape from them was believing the doctrine that they were giving you. And so it was lie upon lie upon lie, much like we see people in the government today. They will create a problem and then come in and say, we're now going to solve this problem that we have created.
Yeah. And we're the only ones that can solve it. So it was that feeling growing up of like, it totally makes sense to have absolute obedience and believing this story, because the alternative is death. The alternative is game over, and you're going to be found and you're going to be tortured. Like the stakes were always so high.
Yeah. And by the way, this is one of the ways I counter the apocalypticizing a little bit, right? Because I sort of say to people, okay, so, this is going to sound morbid, but he was a 20-year soldier. My husband, he always used to say like, oh, how do you fly, in combat zones and all this? And he says, I always figure it'll either work out or it'll immediately not be my problem. And so, I will say to people, like, the purpose of disaster planning is for you to think, what would you do? So you want to think about the worst case? Okay. Say the worst happens, right? What are you afraid of? Labor camps? You afraid of death? Like what you're going to find out? What are you afraid of? Now, what would you do? And I feel like this can be a good shot of reality. I do this to myself all of the time, right? What am I afraid of? Okay, what would I do? I used to like walk through this when my husband was deployed, and I was an expert on how people like my husband died, because that's how we met, right? So I'm back home with a baby. He's deployed. I'm just sitting there with open anxiety. And I would literally make an operations plan. Like I would walk myself through, okay, these two guys pull up, right? And I got it down to where I'm like, I have 20 minutes till I can fall apart. I'm sending 4 text messages and making 1 phone call. And then I will have the things in motion that I can just fall apart, right? Because that's what we're afraid of. We're afraid of this thing coming and just wrecking our life. But the thing about apocalypticizing and preppers and all of this, right, is they're so afraid of their lives being ruined that they ruin their lives, right? They're so afraid of someone abusing the children that they accidentally build a cult and abuse the children, and so really just looking at that fear and being like, okay, the worst has happened. What are you, I'm sure you get this, Lydia, but I get asked like why I'm so unflappable all the time. And I've just started looking at people and being like, I've survived the labor camps, right? Like, I, like, what's the worst? And then we'll deal with it. But the living in that when you don't have to be, like, that's the cultiness, and that's the thing that I think makes it, as you said, easy to control, right? Because of course you're going to just follow the leader when the leader is shouting, they're all coming to kill us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's you probably have this experience where you start realizing there are old remnants of like programming or things you grew up with that you didn't quite sweep out of the corners. It's like, oh, there's another thing that popped up. And with the looking forward to the apocalypse, like I've always romanticized the apocalypse, like Mormon and a cult within Mormonism. The idea of having like 5 years worth of everything in a bunker, like even talking about it now, like it just feels so nice.
This is one of the reasons I say there's no sisterhood like the ex-cult sisterhood, right? Because I'm like, the way I would lead a brigade of femmes that took Nazis out into the woods and like came back with that, right? Like, it's fun to sit around and being like, oh, if it was unleashed, right? If I didn't have to like follow the laws of normal society, like, then what would we do?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, bring all your friends to the commune. It is going to be awesome. But like my partner also grew up Mormon. So we're both former Mormons, which was an interesting coincidence when we first met to find out. But we just in like the last few months, we've realized how much we both love like saving and stockpiling things. And we had this weird realization of like, we're going to die with stuff. We're going to have nice stuff. And so we just started using things. Like I've got like the nice candle that I'm burning next to me. And like, I'm using all my face creams. And we just realized, why wouldn't we use it? Why wouldn't we enjoy it now?
This is such an important tip for cult deconstruction, by the way. Thank you for giving this to our listeners. And I also like to say, like, everything we're going through as cult babies, I feel like millennials are going through. And my analogy here is the plastic couch, right? Like, everyone had a grandma whose couch was covered in plastic. And then you never enjoyed the couch because you didn't want to ruin the couch. And I'm from a family that everyone gets like a fancy set of china when they get married. And during our last move, as we were packing the china that we rarely ever used, we were like, we're going to, every time someone comes over, we don't care if it's the best friend, we don't care if it's whatever, like the china comes out, it gets used, the heirloom table gets used, use your stuff, the stockpiling thing is real. I just call it poverty trauma. Like my poverty trauma is still there. My rapture trauma is still there.
And what's interesting about our particular group, we didn't prep for the rapture or the tribulation, right? Because we were convinced that we were going up. So we were going to escape all of that. And what that demonstrated, in my thinking was I didn't have to worry about all of the problems. So it was a cop out, right? So if you talk about global warming, or if you talk about World War III or famine or death, all of that wasn't our concern, because that's just all what you poor bastards are going to have to endure after we are gone. And so, it alleviated us having to think about anything difficult or hard in our lives. In fact, we would come together on that Sunday evening service, and we were a collection, a group of people steeped in poverty, lots of problems. But the goal for that Sunday night emotional catharsis was for a moment to escape all of those problems, to be caught up in this glorious bliss of worship. And so, it's a double-edged sword for those that are prepping. Yes, they do have some things to do, but for those of us that were convinced we're going to escape all of this, we didn't have to think about it. We didn't have to try to wrap our minds around what is happening in the world.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I feel like Mormonism sort of had a combination. Like we needed to stockpile and save everything to get through the hard times. But then when the whole earth burns with fire, in the Mormon church, it's like a common thing that people say, fire insurance. Fire insurance is as long as you gave at least 10%, like at least 10% of all the money you've ever made in your life to the Mormon church, then when the whole earth burns, the Mormons will be raised up. So it's fire insurance. But you've got to have your food storage to make it to that point. So like we were doing all of it.
Oh, can I tell you all an amazing story? All right, so the
Please.
Children of God in the 80s moves to Japan, right? And this is in Japan's heyday of cults, right? So they move to Japan, they have super fancy backers, they're going to go legit. And they make this deal with the government of Tokyo to give them this huge portion of land that they can use for their commune. And basically the deal is they're going to develop this land in parentheses with teenage slave labor. And then they're going to give it back to the government after 10 years, right? And the Children of God made this deal around the world in many places. But they were so chuffed with themselves because they knew that in less than 10 years, in 1993, Jesus was going to come back. So they were not going to have to give the land back to the government. So anyway, needless to say, Jesus did not come back. The land went to the government. Children of God got deported from Tokyo. And I cannot wait to someday go there and like walk around this part of Tokyo that was developed by the cult that like felt so self-righteous, right? About how they were getting one over. And
That's so
here we are.
funny.
Lydia, tell us a little bit about how you started your journey out of that particular belief system and that hyper control, and what led you out, and was there one moment or was it a process? What did that look like in your life?
Yes. So there were moments that led up to it, but a really poignant part was when I was in college, and my dad never stopped looking for his kids. Like 25 years, he never stopped looking for his kids because my mother essentially kidnapped us away from him. He wasn't able to contact us. He just always kept looking. So I was doing this like first independent thing. You know, I'd lived with my mom my whole life, and, you know, GMA essentially, because my mom always lived with GMA. We were always in the same house. And I went to college, and one day I went to BYU, so like the Mormon college. And I went into my bishop's, like the leader of our congregation's office, and he just casually said, he's like, "Hey, your dad reached out, and he's trying to get in contact with you." And I just like went white as a ghost, and I got the tunnel vision, and like I couldn't hear anything that he was saying, and I was going through like this full panic, and all I could get out was like, "He's a murderer. He's a rapist. Don't tell him anything. I'm leaving. Like I'm not in this, the ward, like our congregation anymore. Like I had to leave." I went and I called my roommates. I'm like, "I'm sorry, I never told you this, but you might not be safe. Lock the doors, lock the windows. Like they're Satan worshipers." I didn't say Satan worshipers. I was still trying to be like, I have a stalker. Like I was still trying to like seem kind of normal, but I was terrified. So what my mom did is she came and picked me up. This was like the confirmation of like, yes, he's found you. And she drove me around to all the police departments. And in northern Utah, there's like all these little towns that are really close to each other, and they all have their own police department. So we went around to like 5, 6 police departments. And I went from my whole life listening to these stories, believing them, but they were secrets that I wasn't supposed to tell. I was just hearing my mother and Gma talk about them. 2, I was walking into these police departments over and over, and my mother was having me say the story for the first time in my life. So I would go up and I'd be like, my father has found me. He's the leader of a satanic cult. He's murdered multiple people. He's a rapist. Like, he satanic ritualistic abuse. So, when the Provo Linden police, they don't know what to do with that. They're like, "Okay, what do you want us to do?" But it was in the saying it out loud, it was in hearing my own voice say this, that for the first time, I got this, what we call in our community, like a logical kickback of you say something and there's a part of your brain that doubts it. And I'm saying this, and I remember thinking for the first time, I hope that's true. Like, that's a really big thing to say about someone if it's not true. And that was one of the first little breaking points where I started wondering. And that led to really wanting to know for myself. I'm like, I want to know. I was told there was boxes of evidence that were from the floor to the ceiling of all of the medical reports of the horrible things that had happened and our spine broken and all of this, that medical professionals had to take the entire day off after examining my brother and I, because even though it was their specialty, they couldn't even handle our child abuse, and that it was all documented. And so I asked to see it. I'm like, there's all this evidence. I want to see it. And I got totally shut down. GMA, my mom, they're like, absolutely not. If you see it, your brain is going to be triggered. You'll be under the control of Satan, like not worth it. So I did the first sneaky thing I'd ever done in my life because I knew where the boxes were. And I went in and I looked inside, and there were boxes and boxes. And it was documentation of letters of my dad wanting to see his kids. Please come home. Why didn't you show up? I've been trying to see my children for a year. Like, whatever you need, we can sort this out. There was like all of these letters from him. And then there was a big, thick packet that was a training manual written by some church for police officers to recognize satanic rituals and the signs and how Satan worship works. So I started opening this packet. And as I flip through, it's like, oh, well, Satan worshipers, they baptize children in blood because they do the opposite of what God does, which is baptize them in water. And so it was like a whole list of all the things that Satan worshipers do. And this packet wasn't about me. This was like an educational packet. But I had been told verbatim everything that was in that packet had happened to me personally. And I had this realization of, this is all made up. Like, I started making all those logical connections. Like, well, how do they know that my spine was broken over and over and all this happened? Either they weren't there, so they don't know, or they were there and they let it happen. Like, my brain started putting these logical conclusions together. And that was the breaking point of really understanding this is a made up story.
And this really demonstrates, I think, a point that just always applies, always, which is if it's valid, it stands up to scrutiny. Like, and when you're asking to see proof of stuff and you're getting shut down, it's valid, it stands up to scrutiny. And I add to this for people, there's no valid reason for an organization to tell you not to speak to ex-members. Like, right? Like, there just isn't. If it's valid, it stands up to scrutiny. And by the same token, like, comparing something to a cult or a bad group doesn't hurt them if they're not a cult or a bad group. So when you, like, my first, like, huge, like, blaring red flag is, like, when you ask to see proof and they start stalling and they start making it, I'm sure, right, about you and doubting and, oh, this is what happens. And instead of just showing you, because literally, if all of these horrible things had happened to you and your loved ones had proof of it, they would just be able to say, here it is.
Yeah.
So Lydia, did you confront the folks that were perpetuating these lies, or what did it look like? What were the next steps for you?
Yes, so I did confront my mother and Jima, and I told them that I had looked in the boxes and I didn't see anything. And they simply just would not talk about it. Like, they didn't get defensive. They're like, we will not talk about this. And at them, I had been so practiced in like suppressing my emotions that I wasn't like mad. I was just confused. I was like, but I don't understand. Like, why would you say this if there was no proof? So I really genuinely was curious and wanted to understand, and, was open to hear what they said. Maybe there's another box somewhere else. It's like, maybe I missed something. But my mother very vehemently told me, I would rather you blame me and think that I lied to you your whole life than talk about it and have your brain break and be controlled by Satan, and will never get you back. So that is where it ended. And I kept trying, years after that, if we were just talking about the weather, because it was always very surface after that, and I wanted to have a real conversation, it was just completely shut down. So it just never went anywhere. They were never willing to talk about it until much later. Just a few years ago when I talked to Jima, and And she came up with an amazing explanation. Happy to share that. But at the time, they just shut it down.
And so did you manage to reconcile with your birth father?
Yes. So
And I assume that he
Yeah.
told a completely different story on the other side.
Oh, absolutely. And he'd been trying to contact us for 25 years. And when I found out that it wasn't true, there was really no action that I took. And I think that's part of, the time and the healing that it takes to leave a cult is I'm like, well, I don't know him. And maybe he is a scary person. It's like, there's probably something valid here. So I just sat on this information for years. And I was getting into meditation, which was like a little edgy as a Mormon, but I saw the benefits. So I was getting into meditation, and one day I was meditating. And I have not had an experience like this before or since this moment. But in the meditation, just sort of out of the blue, I got this very strong message of your dad is going to die and you will have never known. And that landed in a way that it seemed impossible. Like I had my own daughter at that point. She was about the age that I was when my mother kidnapped me away from my dad. And I remember looking at her and being like, if she disappeared tonight, what would stop me from caring about her, like trying to find her? And I had this new understanding. And so I had an old email address from when my dad found me that fateful day at my college. And I reached out to him, and he sent me back this beautiful email of like, is this my daughter? Is this true? And it ended up that he had just moved back to the United States like a month before, because he was living in Taiwan where the rest of my family was. And we were only 5 hours apart. And so I drove with my daughter and my husband at the time, drove to like a Starbucks inside a grocery store in like Asheville, North Carolina, like sort of halfway point. And I was so scared. Like, even though I knew it wasn't true, as I was driving, I remember just looking out the window and like seeing the trees go by, and I was just soaking in everything. I was like listening to the sounds my daughter was making in the back seat, because I just knew this was the last day I was going to be alive. Like, I just knew I was driving to my death. Like, everything in my nervous system was like, you are dying going to meet your dad. And the moment that I walked into Starbucks, I saw this old Chinese man that was sitting at a table, and he turned around and we saw each other, and we just both broke into tears. And all of that fear, all of that you're going to die, all of that lifetime of if you ever meet your dad, that'll be the last day you've ever been alive, just completely melted away. And we just cried and hugged each other. And I found out I had a little sister, and she was there, and she was like the same age as my daughter, and they've been best friends ever since. And that has been one of the most beautiful and rewarding relationships that I could imagine, because my dad wasn't just not an evil person. My dad is an incredible human being that has loved his children with no contact from them, that has found his own healing after his life was completely destroyed by my mom and Jima, that has found like kindness. And he texts me like every day and gives me life advice that he never got to give me growing up. So yeah, my dad is amazing.
That's a beautiful story. Wow. So where are you at today, and what does your life look like today? Obviously, you're taking a lot of what you learned and you're channeling that into helping others. So what does that look like for you today?
Yes. So it's interesting because as I was getting out of the cult, I was finding some neuroscience principles that were really, really helping me. It started in that moment where I said those things out loud and my brain was able to doubt it. And I started understanding how my brain worked. And it really helped me in the healing of, moving out of a cult where I could live a normal life and, have a family of my own and, build a career and do all the things that, like, for instance, my brother was never able to do. Like, he's been in a basement for, decades and it hasn't ever like moved forward in life. And I was able to do that because of working with my brain. And I thought that I would just never use those principles again. I was really grateful that they essentially saved my life. But then later on, I developed a life-threatening eating disorder. And I was completely out of control. And I was at a low point where I didn't know if it was worth living, if I was going to be in this awful cycle with binge eating and starving myself and binge eating again and out of control. And I remembered those principles of understanding my brain, of how to deprogram from a cult. And I'd been trying things for my eating disorder for years, and it just kept on getting worse. And I remember wondering at that low point, I wonder if I could deprogram from an eating disorder like I deprogrammed from a cult. And in 1 week, I was completely free. I never wanted to binge after that. Like, it was not even just managing it, like I was done with my eating disorder. And I was a health coach at the time, so I had a big network of people. There was a lot of hypocrisy there, clearly. I was totally out of control and a health coach, which definitely happens. And so I started helping other people that had been struggling as well, and found that that set of principles was extremely effective. So we've helped over 1,000 women to end their eating disorders. And then that group of women was like, this is the most effective thing I've ever done in my life. What else does this apply to? So that's when we started our executive coaching, doing leadership training for the US Army and for leaders at Disney, Adobe, and National Geographic. And so helping leaders to understand their own brains and match their identities to their goals. And at the She Center, really, our mission is to restore women to leadership. We believe that the root of every problem in the world is the missing influence of women. And so we're here to restore that influence in decision-making and leadership and the wisdom of women in the world, because we see that's incredibly, incredibly effective. So we support women moving through creating new chapters and not wanting to pollute their present with their past, and really letting their past go and rewriting their own story. So that's what we do now, and coached 9,000 women, over 9,000 women since 2010. And it's been an absolute joy of my life. And we love our community. And it's one of those things that makes me grateful for growing up in a cult, because those principles came in handy
And
of getting out of that.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful way, right? To take, what was evil and harmful and traumatic in all of our lives, and to turn that around and to try to find a way to not only help ourselves but to help others. So, wow,
Yeah.
thank you, Lydia.
And I think it's such an important thing to the power of deconstruction, right? Like, I've always found what you said, like, once you can name it, you kind of almost have a handle on it, like, oh, can I apply these to this, and like, I've been through some similar eating disorder stuff as you. It's inspiring to hear you talk about that. But I think, once we deconstruct, like, we get to use all of that stuff that was like in our experience. And one of the things I'm really proud of Uncultured, and for those watching on YouTube, you can get it signed, attached here now, because we're fancy like that. One of the things I was proud about is I think something that I showed was that cult babies can teach us stuff other than just surviving trauma, right? Like, we understand group dynamics and programming and leadership, right? And some of these things that we were talking about, like, at this very deep intrinsic level, and we see patterns that other people don't see. And I used to think it was trite when people said, like, oh, I wouldn't change how I grew up. But now that I've actually done healing, I'm like a little embarrassed that I'm starting to feel that way, right? Like, I'm starting to feel like, no, I get it, right? Like, I use so many of the skills that make my life what it is and my relationships what they are from the things that I've been through and the healing and all of that. So that was really beautiful what you said, and your whole story, really.
Thank you for asking, and thank you for sharing. And I love that we get to be on the other side of these stories and to be sharing that. And it's like, it's not acceptable the way that we were treated or raised, or these systems. And you might as well get all the gold out of it, right? You might as well enjoy how great you are at focus and singing and doing harmonies, or whatever the weird stuff that was like hammered into our experience of mastering skills that we can still enjoy.
Oh my gosh, I'm writing a musical, and I'm like, I'm going to put it on, and it's going to play for 10 years because all the cult babies are going to want to come and sing and dance and perform. And like, we're going to get through it by embracing performance culture, right? Like,
I love it.
Amazing.
I love it so much.
Absolutely. Lydia, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll have all of your contact information in the show notes. So if people want to reach out to you and support you and support your work, And I feel like we've got to have you back at some point in the future, because there's so many parts of your story that we didn't get to that we want to talk about and unpack, because it's so very helpful. So Lydia, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me on. It's such a joy, and I really appreciate your message. And it's always so good hanging out with our other cult babies.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you that watch and listen on a weekly basis. We are so appreciative of you. Do us a favor and hit that subscribe button, that like button. Leave us a review. That's always helpful for the analytics to get the information out. Support Daniella. Purchase her book if you haven't done so already. Check her out on all of the social medias, as well as myself. I'm there too, so you can find me. And our delightful producer who does a wonderful job, Haley. They do a tremendous job week in and week out, and so we're so appreciative to what they do. And to all of you, thanks for being here. And for Daniella, Mestyanek Young, my name is Scot Loyd. We'll see you on the next episode of Cults and the Culting of America.